Okay, I think we're recording now.
All right.
Great. Hi, Rachel. How are you?
Hey, Lars, I'm great. How are you?
Doing well, thank you. So, for those of us who don't know who you are, I'd love for you to introduce yourself.
All right. I am uh, I'm Rachel Lang. I'm an astrologer based in Los Angeles, and I've been in practice since 2006. And I also am a psychic medium, so I incorporate those things into my practice as well.
Incredible. And we met through NCGR LA, where we are both on the board. So, what position do you hold?
Yes, I'm the vice president of the local chapter, and I'm the outreach director for the international chapter,
That's so
the
awesome.
whole organization.
Cool. Well, very good to know as well. And I'm the outreach director for the local chapter. So I love that we have that dynamic. And I'm an astrologer as well for people who don't know me, in addition to several other hobbies that I have. And I took an advanced progressions class with you last year and just absolutely learned so much and love the way in which you present material, and it inspired me to do this series, which is I want to take scary natal aspects and sort of like flip it on its head a bit. Of course, acknowledging, that there is work to be done with them. But when I first learned about my Venus Square Saturn, which is an aspect we share, uh, I was devastated by what I was reading. I felt like I would be alone forever.
Yeah, I know. I know. I was trying to find the positive in it when I first read about it, when I first learned about it, when I was studying however many years ago. I'm a little
Yeah.
older than you are. But I think when you have these scary aspects, as I love the way you say that, but when you have these scary aspects and you live with them, you learn how to mediate them, you learn how to work with them, you make the most of them. And then suddenly they become a part of your character. And then, like, I wouldn't trade my Venus Square Saturn for anything.
Amen. I agree with you. I'm just getting to that point pre-Saturn return where I'm finally like, no, I'm so happy I have this. And that's a beautiful thing about astrology in general. It's that as a tool to navigate life, it shows you that you're always a work in progress. There's always
Mm-hmm.
more to be done. And my Sagittarian behind loves that.
Yeah,
Just keep running towards the horizon, essentially.
yeah,
Um,
definitely,
but
definitely.
I'm going to share my screen.
Okay.
I think that it should still record, I would imagine. But I titled this Venus Square Saturn Taking the Scare Out of the Square.
I love it.
Appreciate it. So, going into it a bit, I guess my question to you, as someone who consults with countless people and then also enterprises and businesses, being, NCGR internationally, why are squares so scary?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, I think squares are scary because unlike oppositions, which you don't often see about yourself because they're often projected in relationships. So they're aspects of yourself that are in shadows that you see in other people.
Mm-hmm.
Squares are like that internal tension, those like beliefs, those limitations, those things, those aspects of your personality that you're refining, that you're perfecting. And so you're constantly aware of them. And they're showing up in your everyday life on an internal way. It's kind of like the two voices in your head that are arguing back and forth. So squares can be scary, but I think we're here to dispel that myth.
100%. Yeah. And I love that you talk about sort of the internal turmoil of a square versus the opposition, because I think for me personally, that's what became so scary, in my early 20s, learning astrology on my own and really struggling with this square aspect. And then my other square aspects was that there's a sense of restlessness that comes with the square because, you're dealing with it yourself. And then also, I found that, especially when it comes to squares to Saturn, doubt is a common theme as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, they're always referred to in lineage as disharmonious or tense, and that isn't incorrect. That's a correct statement. But they also are. They point to where your Rocky montage is in your chart for sure.
Yeah, definitely. One thing I think going along with that same thought, is that because these are aspects of yourself that you're refining, they show they often show you're capable of hard work. I think about people who have a lot of squares in their charts, and they're successful people. They're people who overcome obstacles and adversity, and people who are here to do the work. You know, their soul signed up to show up in this lifetime and to power through. I think like Bill Gates has a number of squares in his chart. You see a lot of squares in the charts of a lot of really successful people.
100%. I did this a while ago, so I don't have a long list, but one of my favorite things online every so often when I'm bored to do is like look at aspect generators for celebrities and compare it to yourself. And my favorite for Venus and Scorpio square Saturn and Aquarius, which is my particular square, was Jon Stewart. Which,
great example.
You know, I think is a great example for multiple reasons. He has been in one relationship, but he sort of was a late bloomer in relationships. It comes across like he married later in life than most people, especially for a heterosexual relationship. And then from a values standpoint, he's someone that I'm very valued aligned with, and with Venus being so representative of self-worth and values, I feel like just really has blossomed into someone who, not only with his show, but also like with his work he's done in Congress for the 9/11 fund, he is someone who is so has embodied his values and knows his worth too.
Yeah, definitely. It's a good example.
Awesome. So I think probably how we're going to structure this series is we're going to talk about both in separately, like both entities separately, and then we'll just like summarize the square. Since I would like this to also be educational, I'm sure we're going to have some of our colleagues taking a look at this, but for just any ordinary person who, like me when I was 21 or 22 and first learned about Venus Square Saturn and didn't have somewhere to go to feel better about it, I'd love for this to be a resource.
Yeah, definitely.
So with Saturn, it's called a malefic. Why is it called a malefic?
Well, the malefics are Saturn and Mars. They're traditionally kind of like the astrological planets that don't want to support your happiness and well-being. Although, as we were talking, Lars, before this, I kind of have the view that all planets have have positives and positive manifestations and more challenging manifestations with how they present themselves in our chart. So I look at Saturn and I think Saturn's actually one of my favorite planets.
Nice.
Because of some of what we're going to talk about. Saturn helps us create structure and stability for our lives. It has a lot of positives. So when you hear the word malefic, don't get scared.
Right.
Don't be worried about it. It just means that this is like traditionally one of the more challenging planets in the way that it manifests itself in our charts.
Totally. When I hear the word malefic, I think about that like demon from Fantasia in 1940, like Chernobog or whatever. And, you know, I absolutely agree with you. Maybe this is the super modern guy in me, but I feel like we talked about before, the condition of every planet is so circumstantial and on an individual basis. And I love this bullet point here about Saturn being the teacher. I'd love for you to talk about, because it's a great way to view Saturn.
Yeah, thank you. This is how I see Saturn, as being the teacher in school who wants you to do really, really well, but it wants to challenge you and push you to your limits in order for you to learn and master the lessons that it wants you to learn. Wherever Saturn is in your chart, whatever sign it's in and whatever house it's in, those are the hard lessons that you're going to master in this lifetime, and you won't get out of this life without having been risen to the level where you could actually teach those things to other people or mentor others in those areas of life.
Totally, 100%. And I, my first job as I was first exposed to astrology was as a second grade teacher. And so I love that view. And actually, my professional development taught me to be a no-nonsense nurturer and not an enabler. And I would view Saturn as like the most ideal no-nonsense nurturer. It's all about reality.
Yeah.
I think you use some terminology like it'll give you pop quizzes. It'll really like make sure you know your stuff right.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, it's only to elevate. And you know, from the enabler standpoint, I got so much Sag in my chart, so I love being Jovian. But Jupiter absolutely could be an enabler. I feel like.
It can't. Well, also Jupiter is, I mean, it's indulgent.
Right.
Wants no limits, all possibilities.
100%.
And so Jupiter,
It's all theoretical. It's like viewing, like looking to the horizon, where Saturn is like, where are you in this moment though?
right,
What ground are you standing on?
right, yeah. Well, Saturn is the last, the ancients, it was the last visible planet that they could see. And so it represents not our limitations, but our perceived limitations. So
Wow.
it's the aspects of life where we project limits onto other people, like, oh, my partner says we can't do this, so we're not going to do that. Well, it's our perception. But if you shift your perspective, your perception, and change your perspective, then that's how you overcome some of those Saturn hurdles.
Absolutely.
So,
I love that. I am a very ninth house person. So like I mentioned to you before, there's going to be citations throughout this video for just resources for other people. One of my favorites is from my friend Colin Bedell, who is an incredible astrologer. And when I first met him, he referred to Saturn as like having the virtues of a leather daddy.
I love
Which
that.
I think makes so much sense. It's how I describe it to clients myself. And so it's really about sort of discipline, structure, restriction, control, which from the internal turmoil standpoint, when you like take the square and you add the square to that, is probably very difficult to overcome. Like as both of us are aware of having squares in our charts, but you know, really only reinforces and strengthens in the long term.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think as long as with any Saturn square, if you realize that often it's the stories you're telling about the control issues in your life or people who are trying to control you, that if you can step outside of those stories and see how you might be participating or allowing, that's one way to overcome uh, your argument with your leather daddy.
I love that. That's so true. And you know, not all leather daddy arguments are negative, but they can be tough nonetheless.
Yeah.
And then lastly, one other keyword that I think is just really good to reinforce, and I'd love for you to touch upon it, is Jessica Lanyadoo on her podcast, Ghost of a Podcast, used the keyword calcification when describing Saturn, which I love because calcification is, while it creates greater rigidity, it actually reinforces what it's calcifying. And then you had a medical sort of astrology thing you were going to add to that.
Sure. Well, I mean, going along with that thought, you know, Saturn rules in our bodies. It rules the bones and the teeth, those rigid structures that support us, that keep us upright, that offer our entire body's structures and kind of form the structure around which everything else can be designed. So thinking about Saturn as like your bones, or in any area of your life, it's what keeps you stable.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes those are limits, sometimes those are beliefs, sometimes those are, you know, relationships in which you have responsibilities, like your children, your aging parents, those kinds of things. That's all. Those organizing principles of your life are under Saturn's domain.
Amen. 100%. So should we go to Venus now?
Yeah.
Great. Awesome. So just in order to classify it from a traditional lens, I guess, Venus is known as a benefic. I don't think about that monster in Fantasia when I hear the word benefic.
No, you think about the Botticelli painting, you know?
100%. Yeah, you definitely think of the birth of Venus, a very different image, but its condition does matter. And then it rules Taurus and Libra. You're a Libra. So I'd love for you to talk a bit about the primary themes of Venus.
Yeah. So Venus, and I have a Taurus rising too, so I've
There
got
you go.
quite a bit of Taurus or Libra or Venus in my chart. So Venus is it's intimacy, like you have here, intimacy. It's our personal values and our sense of self-worth. How much are we valuing and prioritizing ourselves versus how much are we giving our power away to others in relationships? It's our finances and the things that money can buy. It's how we present ourselves. And as a sidebar, I can always tell someone's Venus planet placement by how they dress.
Interesting.
Yeah, you're going to start noticing this now after I say this.
Totally.
But we dress like our Venus.
Oh, okay.
And our Venus and our ascendant. It's like a combination. And it's also our aesthetic sensibilities.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah.
That makes a lot of sense. That's great. And so one other thing I wanted to add as well, just to cite, was my first astrologer who like started me on this journey up the mountaintop was Gal Sasson, and he's a Kabbalistic astrologer. And so he ties Venus specifically to the sphere of eternity, which has a lot to do with pleasure, nature, and art. Mm-hmm. And just sort of like where your like what your eternity is, and what sort of like fuels you for eternity lies in your Venus, essentially, is like from what I got from his teachings. So felt like it was important to cite. Anything else before we talk about what happens when these two luminaries square each other?
Yes, one thing, Lars. So we've talked a lot about the condition of planets, mm-hmm. But I thought maybe we could just specify for those people who don't understand that terminology.
Really good
what
point.
We're talking about. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So go ahead. I'll let you start.
So yeah, I mean, it really depends on the modality, whether your Venus is fixed, it's cardinal, or it's mutable. It depends on what sign it's in, and it depends on the aspects that are forming, from it, right? So you could have a benefic like Venus, but if it's in the 12th house, and it's squaring Saturn and it's squaring Pluto, it's going to probably be not as easy as, say, a Venus that's in the 7th house or in the 2nd house or something. Mm-hmm. And is forming harmonious trines and sextiles to what I just listed.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would add too that there are some signs where Venus feels right at home, where she just feels great. She's going to feel great in her own sign of Libra or Taurus. Those are the two signs she rules. She's going to have a little bit more of a challenge in those opposite signs of of Scorpio or Aries. And so you want to look to, when you're trying to figure out the condition of a planet, there are ways in which you can sort of grade it, if you will, mm-hmm. Based on exaltation, based on detriment, based on is it in its fall, is it domicile, and then also based on what house placement it's in. And I mean, there's a whole range of characteristics and qualities that you could look at to really get a sense of, is your Venus happy? Is she working for your benefit? Is she really making the most of that energy in your chart, or is she a little bit debilitated in her expression of herself?
100%. And I think it's important to note that even with things like detriment, fall, exaltation, it in no way means you have a good or bad Venus, right? I think my issue with like really old school definitions and write-ups have been that it really sort of quantifies in a black and white scale, good or bad, which fortunately in our modern age has been pushed back upon, where we can really understand the nuance of things. So, I have Venus and Scorpio squaring Saturn, right? But in no way does it mean, there you go, right? Like we both have that, but in no way does it mean that our Venus is bad. If anything, I've fallen in love with, my Venus placement in particular. And, when we talk about the actual square, what that means for me, it just has a lot to do with the fact that when quantifying an aspect, it is very much based on the nuance of the condition of it.
Yeah.
If you're someone who is watching this and you have Venus in Scorpio like us, or Venus in Aries, you have a beautiful Venus that there's a lot of high-minded virtues to them, but they can also, they also have their own challenges as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, so I think it's like what we're trying to do with the series in general is take the judgment out of it.
Amen.
Out of all of it. And really at the end of the day, when you learn to work with your chart, you gain self-acceptance, you gain self-love, and self-mastery as well.
All great things, and all reasons why I use astrology as a tool to navigate life, for sure. So in going into Venus Square Saturn and having a discussion on it, I think one thing that we touched upon beforehand, which is important for the nuance and sort of building upon what we just were discussing, was the condition of the actual aspect itself. And so as someone with a fixed Venus Square Saturn and have counseled others with a fix, this applies to cardinal as well, there is nuance there. It really, like, one way to view it in a positive lens is a ride or die aspect. Given Saturn's sort of rigidity, and also how Venus is tied to values in addition to self-worth, there is an element of like, no, I'm taking this extremely seriously. I'm fixed in this. I value the time, effort, energy that I have put into this, and also value the other person in this. So it's very much like in this to the bitter end, which in one respect, like the downside to that could be, it's important to always self-assess yourself and the relationship, and, continue to try to work on things.
Right. Absolutely. I mean, I think one of the ways that that I experience this, because we both have this transit or this aspect, is I remember like in my first significant relationship, I said, I will work at this. I will stay. I will make this work, is actually what I said.
Yeah.
And so I think that's the great thing. If you are lucky enough to date or be in a partnership with someone who has this aspect, that this is the type of person who's not going to give up. And this is one of the real great things about having a square, is that that you are here to refine and perfect any challenges that arise in relationships. So
amen. I think, just once again, like viewing a square as a Rocky montage based on what you just said is like, you're here to have a Rocky montage with this, right?
Yeah.
And the hope is that, you adhere to that, because it worked I haven't seen all the Rockies, I'm not going to lie, but I'm pretty sure he won at least one of those fights, right?
Yeah. You know what? I don't think I've seen all of them. I mean, I know I haven't seen them all either.
I just only know the iconic like picture with like,
Yes. Yeah.
But then from the mutable side of things, I know that we talked about like the ride or die notion. There might be sort of a fear and a pullback before you establish that. So I'd love to hear a little bit about your thoughts.
Or sometimes this can present itself as either things start getting hard, or we start moving toward a commitment, and there can be a self-sabotage that comes in, or a tendency to want to skip out just as it starts to get really hard, or right before. Sometimes with mutable squares, it's right before it gets good.
Right.
So they'll stay in the hard part, and then they want to get out in the middle of the hard part before there's a reward. And this is an important point. With Saturn, there's always a reward. There's always a gift. It's like that teacher, you get a graduation. And so you graduate to a new level of understanding about relationships, about finances, about these Venus matters. And so often if you have a square and you make the commitment to stay in it through the hard times, then on the other side of that, there's abundance. There's some kind of big blessing. There's your marriage, your great big wedding.
Yeah.
And I've seen this in my lifetime too, is that there, like you said, it's like the Rocky montage, like you go through these sort of internal struggles, and sometimes they're not external. Sometimes your partner is doing nothing wrong, but there's just this internal turmoil about the relationship or about yourself in the relationship. And once you move through that, then it's really good, really good.
Amen. I mean, to me, you really speak to the fact that a reward, another definition for reward is a positive consequence.
Mm-hmm.
Saturn is all
I like
about
that.
consequences,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And so, is it going to be a reward, like a positive consequence, or by pulling out too soon before it gets good, is your consequence like how we traditionally view consequences, right?
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
it's
And
really
of course, if there's abuse, or if there's
right,
if then you don't even question it. Go.
100%, right?
If you can, like in a safe way. But I think if we're talking about a relationship that's relatively healthy, where you're aligned in a lot of ways, and there are little nuances that you're trying to overcome, or little personality conflicts that you're working through, that's what we're talking about with sticking with it and staying in.
Amen. And you know what, like the second bullet point, important to investigate where fears of rejection stem from. I find, that is a big motivator for Venus and Square Saturn people to pull out too soon.
Mm-hmm.
And then I love, like, sort of lastly, I think it's important just to summarize from its foundation, Venus Square Saturn is a self-worth aspect. How do
Mm-hmm.
you feel about that sort of definition?
Well, it's underlying all aspects of relationships, and not just your romantic relationships. I think
Right.
Venus Square Saturn can be friendships too. And we were talking about like not feeling like you fit in, or feeling like a sense of rejection or betrayal from your friends early on in life. And squares are most prominent. We feel them the most early in life, before we move out of them by progression, or before they correct themselves by progression. So a lot of times those early experiences of abandonment, those early experiences of rejection, are ones that we carry with us, and can play out over and over in our relationships.
Right.
And these are what cause us to not ask for what we want in relationships, to undermine ourselves in work, and not ask for a raise or raise our rates or things like that. And so this is the lifelong lessons that we're perfecting, as deepening our sense of value, and valuing ourselves, and not looking externally for that sense of personal value.
Amen. 100%. Totally. As someone who has, like, both of us have lived with Venus Square Saturn, I am just getting to the place where I love my Venus Square Saturn, right? Um, how did, like, when did when did you come around to it, and how do you feel like it benefits you now as both a practitioner and just a full-fledged, adult?
Yeah, great question. Um, well, I think the Saturn return was a really big defining moment for me. And that's when all of my Venus Square Saturn issues came to a head, and my natal Saturn issues came to a head. And I had to really, I went into like a really deep, I started going to therapy, and I started like going in and unpacking and figuring out why I was consistently attracting the same kind of relationships, why I had so many financial fears and things like that. And actually at that time, I started my astrology practice.
Oh.
So it was sort of, one of the ways I was working with it was actually by understanding these planets and the nature of this square. But I think I've come to love it. I got married much later in life, and that's one way that this can present itself. Also, I was always attracted to older partners, and that's another way this can present itself. Sometimes you could be attracted to younger people. And so I've dealt with issues like control in relationships, and not feeling like I had freedom and things like that. But if you realize that these are projections, that these are your own internal struggle that you're projecting into relationships or into your external life, then you can work with the internal beliefs that formed those struggles. You can work with the childhood patterns, and then you can overcome them to have healthy and wonderful and amazing relationships.
Amen. Yeah, I would totally just add to that as a conclusion to this, just to summarize sort of what we're talking about, is like, for those people who are struggling with their Venus Square Saturn, I think it's really important to do an audit or an inventory of your own self-worth. Because how you distinctly how you just summarize that, like, deepening your self-worth will lead to more abundance. I think it's a great way, and like that's really where this Rocky montage lies more than anything.
Absolutely, yes. And look at your progressions too, to see when things are moving, when things are shifting. We are works in progress. So.
Exactly. That's my like biggest love of astrology, is knowing that we're perpetually works in progress, and like not vilifying yourself for any one aspect. It's important to synthesize the whole chart, and then also recognize that you are a work in progress, and there's always improvement to be had. And this is, if any aspect's gonna like force you to improve yourself, I feel like this is one of the top ones I could come up with for sure.
Yeah, definitely.
So do you have anything else to conclude with, or do you feel like
do you have anything you want to share about loving your Venus Square Saturn?
Yeah. Honestly, like, I am 28, so my Saturn return is next January. And I'm gonna start to feel a little wind of it, I feel like, because we just got to Saturn in Aquarius. I do distinctly like really stand by the whole self-worth thing, that I feel like my confidence, breaking any cycles that have been pre-imposed upon me, or like have been self-effacing patterns of thought and behavior, are really tied to my lack of self-worth or seeking validation in others. One other really interesting thing is that I have it in a fixed aspect. And anytime I've had a breakup that's been especially difficult, I've always said the same thing, which is like, I was in this. Like, like, it was never me, like, who wasn't in this. It was the other party. And that's both, a positive, but also something to like, could I have seen a red flag sooner, right? Like, it is very much like important to take inventory, not be so fixed in like your standing by something. It's important to always continually do inventory on it. So yeah, I'm still learning with my Venus Square Saturn. This is also for myself, but I've had a couple of clients recently who also had it, and I feel like this would be a good resource for them, and just anyone out there who is struggling with the old school definitions of this aspect.
Yeah, exactly. There's no such thing as a scary aspect.
Amen. We're taking did we say we're taking the scare out of the square?
Yeah.
That's exactly right.
Exactly.
So we're going to do the rest of the Saturn squares, but I figured because we both share this aspect, it'd be a good first video. So thank you so much. And I can't wait to continue doing this. And then when we are free to like be in each other's presence again, hopefully soon, we'll do these in person.
Yes, we will. That'll be more fun.
I love that. Okay.
Yeah.